What if I told you that the chapter you've worked hardest on is actually the one that's keeping you stuck? And that, my friends, is your first chapter. You know, the one that you've rewritten 6 times, that you've agonized over, maybe even memorized word for word by now. Because it feels important, right? It feels like this is the moment where everything has to land perfectly and where you have to prove that you can actually do this. And so you slow down, you overthink, you keep adjusting instead of moving forward. But here's the truth most writers don't realize. The biggest problem with first chapters isn't your writing. It's the pressure you're putting on it and the way that pressure is shaping how you approach it. So today, I'm going to walk you through 5 elements that every strong first chapter actually needs, and the one thing most writers include that quietly stops their story before it even starts. And more importantly, I'm going to show you how to approach your opening in a way that gets you moving again so you can stop circling chapter 1 and finally start writing the rest of your book. If you feel called to write a book, but writer's block, procrastination, and self-doubt keep pulling you from the page, you're not alone, and you're not meant to stay stuck. Hi, I'm Madison Michaels, author and life coach, and I've created this podcast as a creative space grounded in faith and mindset transformations to help you break through your blocks, gain creative clarity, and finally finish the book you're meant to write. So grab your cup of liquid gold and let's write the darn book together. Hello, my friends, and welcome to Write the Darn Book. I'm your host, Madison Michaels. Now, today's episode is going to feel a little bit different from some of the earlier episodes on this podcast because today we're stepping more directly into the craft of writing. But I want to say this up front because it really does matter. We're not leaving mindset behind. What we're actually doing in this episode is bringing the two together. We're looking at how your mindset, your personality, and the way your brain naturally processes information directly impacts on how you write your first chapter. Because here's what I see all the time with the writers that I coach. It's not that you don't know what to do, and it's not that you're not capable of writing a strong opening. It's that you're sitting in this space of pressure, perfectionism, and overthinking, trying to get chapter 1 right before the rest of the story even exists. And that's the piece that keeps you stuck. So today, I'm going to give you a really clear, practical framework for writing a first chapter that actually works. And at the same time, I'm going to show you how to approach it in a way that keeps you moving forward instead of circling the beginning of your book over and over again. Now, here's the thing about first chapters that nobody tells you at the beginning. They're almost always written wrong the first time. Not because you're not a good writer and not because you don't care about your story. It's because the first chapter you write in a first draft is usually the chapter that you needed to write in order to understand your story, not the chapter that your reader actually needs to be pulled into. And I want to let that sit with you for a moment because I think it's genuinely freeing. Most writers treat a weak opening chapter as evidence that something's wrong with them or with their story. But the truth is that it's completely normal and an expected part of the process. The first chapter of your first draft is often a warm-up. It's you, the writer, finding your footing, and that's fine. What matters is actually understanding what needs to happen in the revised version, the one your reader actually ends up seeing. Think about the last book you absolutely couldn't put down. The one where you looked up and suddenly it was midnight and you had work in the morning and you're thinking, oh my goodness, what am I doing? But what hooked you about it? And almost certainly it wasn't a long stretch of backstory. It wouldn't have been 3 pages of world building, and it wouldn't have been a detailed description of the weather or the setting or the main character's childhood or a lengthy internal monologue about how complicated the protagonist's feelings are. No, it would have been something that hooked you, that made you need to know what happens next. A question was planted in those first few pages that you couldn't walk away from until you had the answer, which is why you kept reading. And that is the job of a first chapter. And today I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. Before we dive into the framework though, I really want to speak to something important. Because if you've ever found yourself rewriting your first chapter over and over again, or perhaps avoiding it completely, or feeling like you can't move forward until it's perfect, that's not a discipline issue. That's your brain trying to keep you safe. Because your first chapter feels like the most important part of your book. It feels like this moment where you're being judged, where you have to prove yourself, and where everything has to land perfectly. So what does your brain do? It slows you down. It gets you analysing. It keeps you circling. Not because something's wrong, but because this matters to you. And that's exactly what we talk about inside Write the Darn Book method, that resistance isn't a stop sign, it's a signal. It's showing you where the pressure is sitting. So as we move through this framework today, I don't want you thinking, how do I get this perfect? I want you instead thinking, how do I make this functional so I can keep moving forward with my writing? Because finishing your book is going to do so much more for your writing and your identity as a writer than perfecting chapter 1 ever will. Firstly, though, I want to take you back to a fairly early period in my writing life. I'd started several manuscripts by that point, maybe 3 or 4, and I hadn't finished one of them yet, not one. I kept starting, I kept getting to a certain point, and then I kept stalling. And at the time, I told myself that the stories weren't quite right yet, or life got busy, or a new story idea pulled me in a different direction. But when I look back now, I can see something else was happening entirely. I remember sitting down with what was probably my 4th manuscript attempt and just writing everything I knew about my protagonist. Pages and pages of it, where she grew up, what her relationship with her parents was like, the defining moments of her childhood, and why she was the way she was. I thought I was doing the work. I thought I was building the foundation. And in a sense, I was, but not the foundation the reader needed. I was building the foundation that I needed as the writer to understand my character. And that's genuinely different. But I didn't know that at the time. Around that same time, I was also a very prolific reader, as I think most of us are. And I started paying attention to the books that I couldn't put down. And I was asking myself, what's happening on these first pages? What is it that makes me not want to put this story down? And what I noticed across different genres and different authors was that almost none of them opened with backstory. They opened with a character already in motion, already in the moment and doing something. They were in a situation that made me need to know what was going to happen next. The story had already started and was in motion by the time I actually picked up the book and started reading the very first chapter. So I went back to my manuscript and I looked at my opening chapter and I thought, this story hasn't started yet. I've been writing about my character and her backstory instead of actually writing her into action. All of that backstory, all of that careful layering of her history, it was sitting in the way of the actual story. It was info that I did need to know to write her well and understand her, but it wasn't the story. The story was somewhere much further in, waiting for me to get out of my own way and let it begin. And that realization came early enough in my own writing journey that it genuinely shaped how I approached every manuscript that followed from there. And this is the foundation of what I'm about to share with you now. I've also seen the same pattern repeated in almost every writer that I work with. So if this is hitting close to home, you're in very good company. It's something that often we all do. Now let's get into the framework. There are 5 elements that every strong opening chapter needs, and I want you to think about each one in relation to your own first chapter as we go through them. The first element is an immediate sense of the world of the story. So notice that I said an immediate sense, not a complete description of the world, and this is a really important distinction. In the first pages of your book, your reader needs to feel grounded. They need to know roughly where and when they are, what the physical and the emotional landscape looks and feels like, but they don't need a full tour. They need enough to orientate themselves, delivered through sensory detail that is specific rather than general. The trick here is to anchor your world in the scene rather than describing it separately. If your protagonist walks into a crowded ballroom in Regency London, you don't need 3 paragraphs about the period setting. A pair of candles throwing shadows across the dance floor, the tightness of a corset, the specific smell of beeswax and something floral, and the feeling of being watched. 4 sensory details, and your reader's there with you in the scene. They're not reading about the world, they're inside it, experiencing it. And as we talk about grounding your reader in the world of your story, this is where your natural modality really comes into play, because the way you experience the world is often the way you describe it on the page. So if you're more visually wired, you'll naturally notice what things look like, the color, the light, the movement, the detail of the area. If you're more kinesthetic, you'll feel into the space. So the tension in the body, the atmosphere, the emotional weight of the moment. And if you're more auditory, you might pick up on the sound first. So dialogue, tone, rhythm, and what's being said or left unsaid. If you're more AD, you'll pick up on the structure of the scene, the logical way a character would notice things or sense things. So rather than trying to force yourself to describe everything equally, start with what comes naturally to you and use that as your entry point, and then layer in the rest. And this is also where your bird personality can start to show up in your writing. If you're more owl, you might find yourself wanting to fully explain the world before the story begins. Hello, I put my hands up here. You want it to make sense, right? You want it to be complete. And if you're more peacock, however, you might just jump straight into the scene without grounding the reader at all, because you're following the energy of the moment. Neither is wrong. It's simply about becoming aware of your natural tendency so you can bring it into balance, and that way appeal to all readers rather than just readers that perhaps have your own modality, which you don't know, right? As the writer, you don't know who's going to read your book. So you want to actually be aware of how you are bringing the reader into your story. Now, the second element is everyone wants a character that they can get behind, right? Your opening chapter needs to introduce your protagonist in a way that creates investment from the reader. And here's where a lot of writers go wrong. They confuse character information with character investment. So telling me that your character is brave and clever and determined gives me information, but showing me that your character is doing something that reveals how they think and what they value in the context of an actual scene, that creates reader investment. We don't need to know everything about your protagonist in chapter 1, nor should we. We have to keep some sort of mystery, and we have to keep the reader wanting to find out more. So we do, however, need to have a sense about what matters to your character, what they want, what they're afraid of, what kind of person they are when things get difficult. And you can achieve this in a single, well-chosen moment, either through a decision they make, a reaction they have, or perhaps a conflict that they face in those opening pages. Let the character act, and the reader will form a relationship with them. For example, in my second book, The Elusive Earl, the first introduction we have to the heroine is basically her climbing out of a window of a townhouse at a ball because she's accidentally become engaged to two men who don't speak English. They're in Italy. So immediately, the reader can tell this protagonist is willing to take risks. She gets herself into very awkward situations. So it gives them an immediate sense of her personality and that curiosity to keep reading. Now, when it comes to creating a character that your reader can connect with, this is another place where your personality influences how you write. If you're more dove, you might naturally go deep into your character's emotional world, which is beautiful. But sometimes that can stay internal for too long without enough external action to anchor the reader into the scene. If you're more eagle, you might move quickly into action and decision, focusing on what's happening, but moving past some of the emotional connection that helps the reader really invest in the story and want to keep reading. So again, this isn't about changing who you are as a writer. It's about recognizing your natural pattern and then making small adjustments so the reader stays with you. Now, the third element is a story question that can't wait. And this is the engine of your first chapter, and honestly, for your entire book. A story question is the thing your reader desperately wants to know the answer to. It doesn't have to be a dramatic life or death question in chapter 1, though it can be. It can be something as seemingly simple as, what is this woman so afraid of? Or will he find out before it's too late? Or how on earth is she going to get out of this situation, like in my Elusive Earl book? In murder mysteries, it's often who is the killer, and the reader is going to stay with that book to find out until the end and see if they can guess ahead of time. So the story question is really what creates the forward momentum that pulls your reader through the pages. Without one, the reader has no reason to keep turning the page. But with one, they physically can't stop. And that's when time can stand still and they can stay up reading till 3 a.m. without even realizing it. So when you're revising your first chapter, ask yourself, what question does the reader have by the end of page 1 that they'll need to keep reading to answer? And if you can't identify the question, that's your revision target. And as we look at the story question, the thing that creates that pull to keep turning the page, your personality can shape how this shows up as well. If you're more owl, you might feel like you need to fully understand everything before revealing anything, which can delay that sense of intrigue. You want clarity first. You want certainty. If you're a peacock, you might create intrigue very naturally, but sometimes without enough clarity to ground the reader in what's actually happening. So what we're looking for here is that balance between curiosity and clarity. Enough unknown to pull the reader forward and enough grounding that they feel safe to follow. The fourth element is tension or conflict in the first scene. And I want to be careful here because tension doesn't mean action. You don't need a car chase or a battle in your opening chapter. But you do need something to be at stake, even subtly and even quietly. Tension is the feeling that something matters, that something could go wrong, that the world of this story is not entirely safe or resolved. Tension can come from external conflict, so two characters in opposition, a protagonist facing a difficult choice, but it can also come from internal conflict, a character who wants two things that can't coexist, a character who knows something and is trying not to let it show. It can come from dramatic irony when the reader senses something the character doesn't. What it can't come from, though, is an absence of conflict. A first chapter that introduces a character who's fundamentally okay in a world that is fundamentally okay gives the reader nowhere to go. And tension is another interesting one because it often reflects your relationship with conflict as an author. So if you're more dove, you might soften tension without even realizing it because your natural instinct is harmony and emotional safety. And if you're more eagle, you might push tension quickly and strongly, sometimes before the reader is fully anchored in the scene. So again, awareness gives you choice. It allows you to shape the experience for the reader rather than writing purely on instinct. Now, the fifth element is a promise of what the story's about. Your first chapter makes a promise to the reader about the kind of book they're holding. It establishes tone, genre, the emotional register of the story. A first chapter that is funny and warm and light is promising the reader a certain kind of experience. A first chapter that is dark and unsettling and atmospheric is promising something else entirely. The issue arises when the first chapter promises one thing and the rest of the book delivers something different. So think about your first chapter as a contract with the reader, that this is what you can expect reading this book, that this is the kind of story I'm telling. This is how it's going to feel to be inside this world. And when that contract is clear, readers who are the right reader for your book will know it immediately and they'll stay. When the contract is unclear or it changes mid-book, you lose readers who might have been completely right for you if the opening had reflected the actual story. So to bring these 5 elements together, your opening chapter needs an immediate sense of the world through sensory grounding, a character that we can invest in through action and choice, a story question that creates forward momentum, tension that signals something is at stake, and a clear promise about what kind of story this is. So as you're listening to these 5 elements and thinking about your own first chapter, I want you to remember that the first chapter doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to open the door into the story. That's its job. And you're allowed to go back and refine it later. You're allowed to deepen it. You're allowed to rewrite it, but later. You can't refine a book that hasn't been written. So the goal here isn't perfection. The goal is movement. The goal is allowing the story to begin. Now, here's the bonus thing that I promised you in the teaser, the thing that most writers include that they shouldn't, the biography dump. The first chapter is not the place for your character's backstory. It's not the place to explain why they became who they are, what shaped their childhood, what happened in their past that set all of this in motion. That information can exist in your story if it needs to exist, because sometimes it doesn't. But it earns its place when the reader already cares about your character. In chapter 1, backstory stops the story every time. So if your first chapter includes more than a few sentences of directed backstory, that's your revision point. Drop your reader into the world. Give them a character to follow. Plant a question they can't leave unanswered. Put something at stake and make the kind of book you're writing unmistakably clear. That's a first chapter that works and that gains the reader's interest and gets them to keep turning the page. Your homework from this episode, my friends, is to go back to your first chapter and look at it through this lens. Not just where the elements are working and where they're missing, but where you're getting caught in your own thinking. Where are you overanalyzing? Where are you hesitating? Where are you trying to get it right before allowing the actual words to exist? Because that's the real work. And this is exactly what we do inside my coaching. We don't just look at structure, we look at how your brain is interacting with that structure. We work through the resistance, the perfectionism, the pressure, and we build a writing process that actually works for you and how you are uniquely wired as a writer. So if you're ready to stop circling your opening chapter and start making real progress on your book, you can find all the details at madisonmichaels.com/coaching. I'd really love to support you inside that journey. Oh, and as a bonus, everyone, I've just updated my website to include a writing resource library for you all. There's a whole collection of free tools and tips and guidebooks for you, as well as some paid visualizations and other things. But take a look, go to madisonmichaels.com/library and take a look. You can download whatever you want for free. And I really hope that supports you in your writing journey. All right, my friends, thank you so much for spending this time with me today. The first chapter is one of the most important things you'll ever write. And the fact that you're here learning and refining and taking your craft seriously tells me everything I need to know about the kind of writer you are. You're the kind of writer who finishes. So keep going. And remember, you're the vessel for the story. Let the words flow through you and onto the page. Until next time, my friends, take care and let's write the darn book together. My friend, I hope today's episode gave you exactly what you needed for your writing journey. And if it did, would you take 30 seconds to share it with another writer who's struggling to start or finish their book? And if you're loving the show, I'd be so grateful if you left a quick review. It means the world to me and truly makes my day to know that this podcast is helping you. And as you head back into your week, I hope you feel more supported and connected to your creativity. And remember, you're a vessel for the story. So let the words flow through you and onto the page. All right, I'm off to refill my cup of liquid gold and go and do a little writing of my own. Take care, and I'll meet you back here in the next episode of Write the Darn Book.